The crack of a single gunshot shattered an ordinary campus forum and left a nation searching for answers. Charlie Kirk was struck while speaking at Utah Valley University, and what followed has become a complicated, wrenching story of silence, a sudden confession, contested explanations, and questions about the unseen forces that might have pushed one young man to a catastrophic act. If you want to follow every development on this unfolding investigation and hear carefully reported updates as they arrive, hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you don't miss our coverage. Tyler Robinson initially stayed silent after being charged with Charlie Kirk's murder. For days after the shooting, the world watched a developing police investigation and a shattered community without hearing the voice of the person authorities say pulled the trigger. That silence was not merely an absence of words. It shaped the atmosphere around the case, amplified speculation, and left families and investigators working with fragments instead of narrative. When a suspect refuses to speak, several practical things happen. Investigators must rely on physical evidence, digital footprints, and witness accounts. Prosecutors prepare cases without the benefit of a defendant's statements, and the public, hungry for an explanation, fills gaps with rumor and theory. In this particular instance, the silence was especially striking because the shooter, according to authorities, had spent years in online spaces and left traces that could have explained motive, yet initially, he said nothing to law enforcement in an official setting. That vacuum created two immediate consequences. First, it prolonged the uncertainty for Charlie Kirk's family and supporters who wanted to know why their loved one had been targeted. Second, it created a fertile ground for competing narratives. Political allies of Kirk were eager to link the act to extremist ideology or organized opposition, while others feared a rush to blame without evidence. The legal strategy behind silence is not new. Defendants sometimes exercise their right to remain silent for strategic reasons, to avoid self-incrimination or to wait for counsel. But in a case of high public interest, the absence of a statement can function as a de facto signal in the court of public opinion, and that signal has consequences. Investigators pressed forward, combing videos, forensic traces, and digital communications to piece together a timeline, and the community had to live in a liminal space between grief and a desire for clarity. That blankness made the eventual confession that followed feel, to many, like a seismic shift rather than a predictable step in criminal procedure. His silence fueled speculation, frustration, and unanswered questions for families and investigators. When a suspect declines to speak officially, it doesn't mean people stop talking. The opposite often happens. Families, friends, and followers reach for any clue that might explain motive, and investigators face pressure to produce findings that fill the emotional and civic need for answers. In the days after the shooting, social media exploded with eyewitness videos, snippets of surveillance footage, and competing interpretations of what those images showed. For the Kirk family, the waiting was especially raw. Not only were they grieving a public figure whose speeches and style shaped a movement, but they were also denied by silence the small mercies that sometimes come from a suspect's admission or explanation. Prosecutors and police worked under immense scrutiny, understanding that their every move would be parsed and politicized. That scrutiny affected investigative choices, when to make evidence public, how to communicate about the suspect's background, and how quickly to move toward charging decisions. Meanwhile, the public's frustration sometimes pressured officials to speak more quickly than they otherwise might have, yet law enforcement repeatedly cautioned against drawing premature conclusions, warning that media narratives are fragile in the face of complex forensics and legal standards. Friends of the accused and community members in his hometown also grappled with bewilderment. Why would someone who appeared ordinary on the surface be accused of such a violent act? The silence prolonged the agony for those who wanted a coherent story, and it forced investigators to work in an environment where each new detail could dramatically alter public perception. Robinson recently confessed, claiming outside influence played a role in the killing. Then the story shifted. In communications reported by prosecutors and revealed in court documents, Robinson conveyed to people close to him that he had carried out the act, but the confession did not come with a simple motive. Instead, it carried a claim of outside influence, that people, ideas, or pressures beyond his immediate self had pushed or manipulated him into doing something he later described in guarded terms. Confessions of this variety introduce enormous complexity into any criminal case. On the one hand, an admission of guilt closes a factual loop. The suspect acknowledges involvement, which assists prosecutors in establishing causation and narrative. On the other hand, when the suspect asserts he was subjected to manipulation, coercion, or persuasion by others, the scope of the investigation can broaden quickly. If true, those claims could implicate additional actors. Organizers who radicalized him online, acquaintances who provided logistics or direction, or hidden leaders who stoked grievances. The mechanics of such influence can look different across cases. Sometimes it is ideological, a torrent of online content that normalizes violence. Sometimes it is relational, a charismatic recruiter who grooms vulnerable individuals. Sometimes it is transactional, money, favors, or threats that change behavior. Robinson's framing of his confession as influenced by others triggered immediate procedural responses. Investigators re-examined his digital communications and social networks for signs of coordination, prosecutors considered new theories of culpability, and defense counsel prepared a narrative that leaned heavily into the claim of manipulation as a mitigating explanation. For observers, the confession complicated the moral calculus. A simple confession can bring a kind of painful closure. One that claims outside influence stretches the case into broader social territory, asking whether the act was purely the product of one person's choice or a symptom of darker networks and cultural pressures that might require systemic responses. Prosecutors argue Robinson is deflecting responsibility to reduce accountability. From the prosecutorial perspective, the confession was not the end of the story but the beginning of a fight over its meaning. Prosecutors quickly signaled skepticism of the claim that Robinson was merely a puppet of outside forces. Their argument, rooted in evidence they say they had already gathered, is straightforward. The physical and digital traces point to deliberate planning, independent capability, and conscious decision-making, not to someone who was only following orders. In filings and court statements, prosecutors highlighted items such as messages that showed Robinson scouting the event, purchases or procurement of materials consistent with an attack, and actions on the day in question that display a level of forethought inconsistent with the notion of coercion. In high-profile cases, prosecutors must show not only that someone committed a crime but that they did so with the requisite mental state to justify aggravated charges. In this case, the prosecution has framed Robinson's conduct as intentional and premeditated rather than reflexive or purely manipulated. That framing matters legally. It increases the chance of severe charges, including capital offenses in jurisdictions where the death penalty is an option, and it shapes public understanding of culpability. Beyond the courtroom, the prosecutorial posture resonated with a public desire to hold an identifiable person accountable for a terrible act. Prosecutors also noted the risk of copycat claims, the concern that defendants might adopt a narrative of manipulation as a way to dodge full responsibility. Their response has been to lean on evidence and to invite jurors and the public to evaluate the totality of behavior rather than the post hoc framing offered in a confession. Defense claims he was manipulated, pressured, and coerced into the act. The defense, by contrast, embraced Robinson's account of outside influence as central to its strategy. Defense counsel argued that their client had been immersed in online communities that normalized extreme ideas and that interpersonal dynamics, romantic pressure, peer intimidation, or ideological recruitment, had eroded his ability to make autonomous choices. This defense approach is not merely rhetorical. It rests on a body of social science that examines how vulnerable people can be gradually radicalized or coerced, particularly via digital platforms that reward extremity, encourage echo chambers, and blur the line between talk and action. The defense sought to contextualize Robinson's life, his relationships, mental state, social isolation, and prior exposure to inflammatory content that could plausibly have shifted his perception of acceptable conduct. They aimed to create reasonable doubt about his moral culpability or, at least, to mitigate the degree of responsibility assigned to him. In practical terms, such a defense opens the door to expert witnesses, psychologists, sociologists, or internet behavior specialists who can testify about grooming, susceptibility, and coercion. It also requires a careful humanization of the defendant in court, something that often clashes dramatically with the family's and public's hunger for punitive clarity. The tension between the defense's narrative and the prosecution's evidence sets the stage for a long, contested legal battle where jurors will be asked to parse complex questions about choice, influence, and accountability. Digital evidence shows planning, hidden clothing, and prepared weapons contradicting his claims. Amid competing narratives, certain pieces of physical and digital evidence have played a decisive role in shaping prosecutorial strategy. Investigators disclosed materials that they say undercut the coercion narrative, messages indicating reconnaissance of the venue, photographs of items purchased or assembled prior to the event, and caches of clothing or equipment hidden in locations consistent with premeditation. Such corroboration is vital in modern prosecutions because it ties subjective claims to objective behavior. For example, if someone says they were forced to act but their phone records, browser history, and purchase logs show deliberate steps toward executing the attack, it significantly weakens a pure manipulation defense. This kind of digital trail can include searches for vantage points, timestamps correlating travel to the scene, and communications that reveal intent or planning. Likewise, physical evidence like stashed clothing, weapon components, or maps of the venue provides independent confirmation of preparation rather than randomness. The interplay between the confession and tangible evidence is central. A defendant may claim manipulation in words, but the forensic record can reveal the breadth of autonomous action. Prosecutors have highlighted these materials to argue that Robinson's claim of being an unwilling instrument does not square with a pattern of behavior that preceded the shooting. Defense teams respond by arguing that availability of planning materials does not prove the absence of coercion. People can be both targeted and complicit in preparing acts while still being subject to manipulation that reduces their moral agency. The jury will have to weigh these competing interpretations against the totality of the evidence. Confession raises debate over truth versus calculated misdirection. When a suspect admits to an act and simultaneously offers a narrative of external influence, observers must choose whether to treat that admission as a straightforward revelation or a strategic recalibration designed to shape outcomes. The distinction is not merely academic. It affects charges, sentencing, and the scope of the investigation. Truth-seeking in criminal cases relies on triangulating testimony against independent evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage, electronic logs, and material artifacts. If the confession aligns with these corroborative sources, it tends to be accepted as genuine and self-explanatory. If, however, the confession contradicts the material record or seems timed to exploit legal or political levers, for instance, if the confession arrives after police close in on co-conspirators or after sentencing exposure becomes salient, then skepticism is warranted. In this case, the timing and content of Robinson's statements prompted fierce debate. Some commentators argued the confession was an honest acknowledgement of wrongdoing complicated by external pressures. Others saw it as a calculated attempt to deflect blame by expanding the field of responsibility. That tension is inevitable in high-profile prosecutions where narratives can influence public opinion and the jury pool. Judges must guard against prejudicial pretrial publicity, lawyers must craft persuasive stories, and investigators must remain open to follow-up leads that the confession suggests, even while pursuing the defendant's own culpability. The result is a legal and moral thicket in which every claim must be measured against documentary evidence. If outside influence is real, others may face investigation or charges. One of the gravest implications of Robinson's assertions, if they are supported by evidence, is that this act might not be the isolated product of a single troubled individual but the endpoint of a chain extending through social networks, online communities, or even organized groups. Investigators take such claims seriously because they can reveal facilitators, financiers, or instigators whose responsibility would extend beyond moral condemnation to legal accountability. The expansion of an investigation can proceed down several paths. Law enforcement can subpoena records from digital platforms to identify communication partners. Prosecutors can seek to unmask intermediaries who provided materials or instructions, and civil authorities may examine whether online platforms allowed harassment and recruitment that culminated in violence. Each of these paths carries practical and constitutional challenges. Identifying third parties requires reliable linking evidence. Charging them with complicity or conspiracy demands proof beyond reasonable doubt, and the political and civil liberties implications of policing online speech complicate policy responses. Still, if the evidence shows that other people actively encouraged, planned, or directly facilitated the crime, a broader set of charges is not only legally appropriate but necessary for a full accounting. The public should be prepared for a layered investigation that may name additional suspects, as prosecutorial resources are marshaled to follow the digital and social breadcrumbs that often accompany modern acts of political violence. The case highlights dangers of online radicalization, manipulation, and hidden persuasion. Beyond immediate legal questions, this investigation exposes a wider social problem: how digital ecosystems can incubate radicalization and erode normative boundaries. In recent years, scholars and law enforcement have documented patterns where individuals become radicalized through iterative exposure to extremist content, peer reinforcement in closed forums, and the echo chambers of algorithm-driven platforms. Those processes can be subtle and slow, moving a person from rhetorical outrage to the moral imagination of violence. Manipulators exploit loneliness, identity crises, or social alienation to recruit followers, often using techniques learned from prior campaigns or from illicit communities. The Robinson narrative underscores how persuasion can operate invisibly and how vulnerabilities can be exploited for destructive ends. That is not to say that online speech is uniformly dangerous. Most online communities are benign, but it is a reminder that certain corners of the internet operate with little oversight, offering both ideological fanning and practical advice for those willing to act. The policy challenge is daunting: how to curb radicalization without encroaching on free expression, how to support at-risk individuals before they turn to violence, and how to create resilience in communities that are targets for manipulation. These are not problems solvable by prosecution alone. They demand public health approaches, education, platform accountability, and community intervention programs that recognize the signs of grooming and provide alternatives to isolation and anger. Robinson's words expand the case, leaving more questions than answers. The net effect of the confession plus contested explanations is expansion, not closure. Rather than settling the story, Robinson's statements pulled the investigation into new territories: digital forensics, network mapping, and psychological inquiry, each of which produces more leads and yet more uncertainty. Family members on both sides now live with competing narratives: the Kirk family sorrowful and demanding accountability, the Robinson family grappling with disbelief and the suggestion that their son was either a mastermind or a victim of manipulation. For the public, the case resists the simple moral framing that helps communities move on. Instead, it forces us to confront multiple, overlapping truths about agency, influence, and the modern mechanics of violence. Trials will parse behavior in excruciating detail, and outcomes will depend on jurors' ability to weigh complex evidence and on the quality of expert testimony. Meanwhile, the broader questions about how society prevents radicalization, how public forums are secured, and how political speech is conducted in an era of amplified animus will persist regardless of a single legal outcome. The confession has, therefore, made the case larger. What began as an act by an individual now points to social dynamics that require a collective response. Wrap up, where we go from here. This investigation is now a multi-layered story: an alleged killer who once kept his silence, a confession that invoked outside influence, prosecutorial insistence on premeditation, defensive claims of coaxing and coercion, and a trove of digital and physical evidence that appears to contradict a simple narrative. What stands between today's confusion and tomorrow's clarity is painstaking legal work, forensic verification, meticulous cross-examination, and the slow accretion of facts that withstand scrutiny. For the public, the case is a reminder that truth is often complicated and that human motives rarely cleave to tidy explanations. The broader lessons are clear and urgent. We must strengthen our ability to detect and intervene in radicalization, we must protect civic spaces without turning them into fortress zones, and we must insist that political disagreement never becomes an invitation to violence. As the legal process unfolds, Investigators will continue to follow leads both close to the shooter and outward into the networks his confession suggests. Families will seek justice and, perhaps, some measure of peace. Communities will debate policy and tone. And the nation will be forced once again to confront how to live with fierce disagreement while guarding against the descent into deadly action. For listeners who want ongoing coverage, we will continue to follow court hearings, forensic disclosures, and any developments pointing to additional actors or exculpatory evidence. Subscribe and hit the bell to get careful, sourced updates as they become available. This is not only a legal story, it is a social one that asks how we protect our public life and our children from the corrosive effects of manipulation and violence. The work of answering those questions begins now, in courtrooms, in community meetings, and in quiet conversations that refuse to let polarization obscure the human costs beneath the headlines.